Good morning, my name is Karolyn McDonnell. I'm a researcher at the National Centre for Men's Health, based in the Institute of Technology in Carlow. Later today at 1:15 p.m, the National Centre for Men's Health and my team, Jack Sweeney, Diana Van Dorn and Conor Hammersley, have presentations to show the work that we do regarding health promotion within our communities in the sphere of men's health. We're also joined by our counterparts in the Waterford Institute of Technology, Steve Daly and Aisling McGrath. So I urge you strongly that when those presentations go live at 1:15 p.m, that you tune in. For the moment, my presentation is about work I completed or gained some professional experience through with my Masters by Research. And it's a small bit of education intervention that I carried out with a colleague in the past few months with 29 students from the Early Childhood Education and Care programme in further psychology module. I previously worked with the National Student Engagement Programme and also with the National Forum for the Enhancement of Teaching and Learning. So student partnerships, student engagement and student enhancing learning for students in higher education is one of a particular research interest of mine. The name of my project is Coming Full Circle, and it is about managing students' assessment expectations using reflection and using the feedback loop. A great part of my my research was impelled by my interests, my professional experience, the MA in Teaching and Learning, which I'm currently studying, and a desire to support student partnership and enhance learning experience for all students. And there's a couple of different contexts around why this particular piece of research is important and it's timely and it's worth disseminating. The first of all, kind of driven by my alma mater in the National Forum, there is an impetus to develop an understanding of assessment of, for and as learning for students. And it's driven by an understanding that students should be partners in their own learning. It's not a case that the student or the teacher is there as expert pouring information into the head of the student who's a novice. It should be much more of a partnership process. But in order to do that, we have to overcome a couple of hurdles, such as the development of assessment literacy for staff and students. And sometimes what some impediments that do emerge is that students don't feel that they have choice or that they have voice or capacity or agency in their own learning. This even came back as far as 2009. The interesting quote there from Nicol. A key issue for academics, especially those who teach first year students, is how to enable students to feel part of their programme's academic culture, but also encouraging them to take responsibility for their own learning. And finally, there's an emotionality attached to assessment and feedback. When students receive feedback, sometimes they can feel judged, they may feel defensive, they may feel that they are being critiqued, and if they don't receive the grade that they want or expect, it can cause some feelings of disengagement or a demotivation to engage with any type of their work. So that was an academic context around why it's important for us to support students around understanding why assessment comes in many different forms. It's not just an exam at the end of the year, and why they need to take more autonomy and responsibility in their own learning. The social and environmental context then was a little bit more complex. When we look at assessment literacy, we also want to understand that students grasp an understanding of how to apply what they learn in the classroom to outside of a classroom context. Basically, we need to understand or to teach students to be able to apply their learning forward. Like some nice studies there, one particular by Ribeiro et al. They have investigated the effects of reflection on students' engagement and found that students who deliberately reflected just invested more time in studying, and they demonstrated more engagement and increased their learning. A nice study then in 2005 by Ash Clayton and Atkinson. They encouraged students to write kind of like in a reflective journal, which they called articulated learning. And they wrote a series of entries as a step of reflection in 3 categories: academic, civic and personal, and where they had to describe and analyse different parts of experiences that they were having, which was not unlike using Gibbs learning cycle, which was done in this particular study, and I'll get to in a minute. Finally, what was really important, and I think any teacher or instructor will be really cognizant of this issue that's come up this year, there has been an impact of COVID-19 on student learning. And for this particular group of students, they were predominantly first-timers to higher education, a young cohort aged between the ages of 18 and 20. They had come from fifth year, sixth year through the restrictions of the pandemic, so through social distancing restrictions, and where they were impelled to use blended learning and online learning platforms, which hadn't really been thrashed out. It was kind of catapulted into it, if you like. So they'll miss out on a lot of those formative experiences that students take for granted, just even social group work, building their own confidence, their own competencies, their own social skills. So that's very much a dearth for young people in the last 2 years who happen to be at that particular cohort. And this is the cohort I chose to work with for this particular piece of education intervention, if you like. So the methodology I employed then was that we held a workshop on reflection together. I linked reflective practices to the early childhood education and care practitioner's role, their responsibilities and their personal development. The assessment brief was then discussed, where I kind of deconstructed every part of that with them, talked about formatting, talked about the importance of producing a professional report, that formatting instructions weren't a suggestion, that it was also part of how things were graded, and also how to approach the assignment, structure, putting together research pieces, kind of deciding what's good research, what's not good research, what topics and how to discuss them, introduction, middle, discussion and conclusion. And students completed and submitted their assessment after that. Just on a side note, the assessment was given by their class instructor, so it wasn't an assessment that I had any part in. I was there to support the students in how to approach assessment. The second step then was after they had completed and submitted their assessment, but before they had received grade and feedback, I engaged in what that unicorn, that myth, that's formative assessment, because in many cases the research or studies or anecdotally people would tell you that students tend not to engage in formative assessment. They look for something that they're graded in. But actually these students were very enthusiastic about this process, which indicated to me that they had a great interest in learning how to learn and learning how to understand things better. I held another workshop with them, and this was prior to receiving their grade and feedback, as I said, and they were guided through the Gibbs learning cycle, which I will show on the next slide. They wrote down their assessment reflection, so it was very, very prescriptive, a prompt through each aspect of their assessment, and they submitted the reflection as part of this qualitative data for this study, and that was data source 1. So this is the cycle that I used, Gibbs reflective learning cycle, and it will be, most instructors or coaches or mentors will be familiar with this cycle. I started with a series of prompts, for example, with description, asked the students, do you remember what the task was? And the assignment brief was up on the board in front of them. And I asked them to think about when did you start? How did you prepare for it? What were you feeling about it? Was it a procrastination exercise, or was it slotted into maybe a very well-kept academic schedule that they had prepared for themselves? Feelings, I asked them to think about how they felt before starting the task. I also asked them to think what else was going on for you at the time. So this assessment was due shortly before Christmas. I asked them to think about what challenges that they encountered in terms of finding time to sit down and apply themselves to this particular task. I then asked them to evaluate that. So think about when you had that piece of work done, what aspects were easy for you and what was difficult, and to think back on that. And they all took notes and did this in a very prompted, prescriptive way to really kind of dig deeper into how they felt about this process of assessment that they were engaging in. I asked them to have think about analysis. And this is important as well. It's one of the key things, I think, key learning for me, but also key learning for the students as well. I asked them to think about what was good about their work. So they didn't know at this point what grade they'd received or what kind of feedback they'd gotten, but I asked them to think about what they felt they had done really well. And then to think briefly about what do you think you could have improved upon. And we got some really, really rich responses from them, that question. I asked them to think about what skills that they might have need to develop, or what approaches would they need to improve their learning. So again, this was a process of asking the questions, and results will be coming up in the next slide. But I asked them to think about what approaches that they might do, what might they think about to improve that process. And then I asked them to look at an action plan. If we were going to do this again, what could I do differently? How could I improve this process for myself? So this was particularly interesting. In my own research, I had found that even when a student got to the point of being on professional practice and deconstructing experience, giving a description, talking about their feelings about that, evaluating, analysing it, concluding it, many, many times the student didn't get to that kind of pinnacle moment of action where they could identify what they might do differently in order to improve the process for themselves. And that was a particularly, I think, pertinent part of understanding how to teach students, or where we have to find that pivotal moment where learning happens and where growth happens. And to be able to support them to articulate this plan of action that they would need. This, the opportunity for learning and personal growth can sometimes be missed, and step 6 actually is the most important. For it to be truly effective in transformation, it needs to be identified by the person themselves. So we can't tell them, you can't tell somebody where that action needs to go. It needs to come from them. And again, this links back to most situations in life, and it links back to experiences outside of the classroom, which is one of kind of things that we strive to develop students for student attributes. So students received their grade and their feedback, and 50% of the students had failed the assessment. Now, let me reiterate, I neither taught the students nor set the assessment. I was brought in to work with them around supporting them around assessment literacy. So the third workshop was held. Students were encouraged to compare their personal reflection against their tutor's feedback, and I opened a class discussion about that. And in fact, that was a pivotal moment in this piece of research, because while there was a tangible air of disappointment from the students, in fact, they were beginning to understand a little bit more, because they've been asked to dig deep and deconstruct how they may have been somewhat responsible for not performing as well as they had. But some interesting findings did come up. They also took a lot more autonomy and ownership over the fact that they had not performed as well as they would have liked. But also, given the nature of what I was investigating here, the value and importance of feedback and the recipients of feedback, I asked the students for feedback as well. And they were asked to suggest alternative methods of assessment for this module. They also completed an online survey informed by Kember et al. And this was to measure their levels of reflective thinking as a result of engaging in this intervention, but these results won't be discussed today. So the word count gives you a bit of an idea of the feedback that students gave around how they felt about approaching the assessment. And there was no holds barred. There was quite emotive language used there. They felt overwhelmed, they struggled, they expressed disinterest, the topic didn't interest them, they procrastinated, they were honest, said that they didn't put the planning in, they were dreading starting it, they were nervous, they felt demotivated, they felt distressed. Very, very honest, I think, and raw reflections on how they felt about the whole process of assessment. It is very important for us to note the reasons behind these feelings. So they not only described that they were worried and they found it difficult, and they panicked and they were a bit frustrated, but they also expressed, we asked where were you at when assessment time was coming, and they talked about managing relationships, working Christmas hours, having family problems, not knowing where to start, afraid of making mistakes. Found it difficult to use the information for the questions asked, which indicated that they needed a little bit of skills development around how to approach assessment. They talked about having sickness, and that can be sometimes things that we forget when we are, planning assessment. So I thought that was pretty interesting, but also a nice learning piece for instructors as well, because we can sometimes forget that those types of life experiences, and that students experience those types of things. But also, most importantly, and I bring back to the context and the rationale for this particular piece of intervention, this is a very young group of students who had just spent the last 2 years in secondary school, and they wouldn't have had those formative experiences around managing time and organising, the autonomy of organising yourself and being responsible in terms of submitting assessment under a deadline, as well as trying to work part-time and manage relationships, all under a cloud of COVID-19 and the anxieties that brought. It very much aligned with Bowden-Falchkov's work around the emotionality of assessment and how students can sometimes avoid assessment because of these reasons, why they procrastinate and they don't plan, and sometimes that they might be defensive. But actually students, the excuses that they gave were very raw and honest. They very much talked about not putting the requisite planning into their assessment, but also, I think there was an element of forgiveness there as well, where they kind of realized that actually, yeah, I'm annoyed that I didn't do as well as I could have done. But when I think about all these things that I was juggling, wasn't I lucky to get something in? And, there's learning in that as well, even though we mightn't have got the grade, but we certainly got the learning out of it. Now, we've all that kind of nasty business about the negative side of assessment out of the way, and part of the workshop was very much not focusing on that aspect of assessment, but more around the positive psychology, which is a strengths-based approach. And this was a really important moment within the workshop too, because when the students had reread their reflections and cross-referenced against their feedback, many expressed that they found it fair. Before they received grade, they'd already identified where they had lapsed in engaging, planning, and their own skills deficit. But at this point of the workshop, the emphasis was what did you do well, and endorsing what skills were that they found they had themselves. And this was really nice. Like, what they identified that they did do well is some of them talked that they realized they had good referencing and formatting skills. But equally, that type of student indicated that they needed more help with the creativity and ideas part of academic writing. Some said that they had that they did very well with structure. A few expressed that they enjoyed the topic, that they felt relieved when they got into it, and they felt relaxed after they'd done the research. Some talked about having spider diagrams and drafts helped them to to get through the assessment, which was really nice. About 6 or 7 students talked about using peer support and discussion, and how they found that a really great help. They talked about that they were excited about approaching the assessment, that it, to kind of get their teeth into something, and that leans a little bit into the longing that Boyd and Falchikov describe about a student who longs to get the validation from the grade, so they get excited about doing that piece of work. And a few talked about that they managed their time very well, and others said that they enjoyed learning new things. This was the really important piece. I asked the students what they needed to do to improve, and if you remember earlier, I mentioned that in Gibbs' learning cycle, even if we get to digging deep and deconstructing exactly what the task was, the description, the feelings, the evaluation, the analysis, and then the conclusion, many times students don't actually put a plan in place for themselves, or they don't identify that gap in their own learning. But this was nice because the students actually did in this case. They were prompted to, and they were able to put a plan of action in place for themselves. So I asked them what they needed to do to improve. And the big one, of course, was restructure my time. But this kind of fell under a couple of different headings. It was not only about restructuring my study time, but it was about restructuring their lives, because they began to kind of grasp an understanding that doing an assessment at this level was not a case of sitting down at the computer and just banging it out, that there actually had to be time to do these drafts, to do the spider diagrams, to organise maybe research pieces, to take time to format afterwards. It could take an hour or 2 hours depending on your skills and on how long the piece of work is. So it wasn't only just rescheduling the academic calendar, but it was looking at how to maybe expand the time that they spent on engaging with assessment. A few talked about researching and referencing skills. They mentioned that they would ask questions and ask for support. Many talked about needing to gain confidence in their writing. So this was obviously a derivative of some positive feedback that they had received. They talked to some who said they struggled or were confused with the question, that they said they needed to read the brief better and they needed to pay more attention to detail. Some talked about starting earlier, time management, planning my study time, again another iteration of time. This was interesting. One or two said that they needed to change where they do their work, that they felt that, you know, doing it from the bedroom wasn't really conducive anymore, that if they took a couple of hours in the library, they would be more focused. And that was really good learning, because maybe somebody had said that to them, hadn't sunk in. When they got an opportunity to reflect upon it, it made an impact. Academic writing skills, of course, came up again. Finally, because this was about student partnership, it was important for me to grasp some feedback from students. So this type of assessment didn't suit. The assessment was an essay type assignment, and then it was to identify a reading and a journal reading, and to deconstruct it based on a template. And in the spirit of student partnership, I asked the students to get into groups and tell me what would suit them in terms of assessment. And the results might surprise you. And there's some really useful feedback that instructors can learn from here. So this is literally straight from the horse's mouth. The students talked about breaking the assignments into smaller assessment, using posters, group projects. This was really interesting. Group projects came up a lot. And in many cases, students shy away from group projects because, you know, the grade is diluted and you're depending on the group dynamic in order to basically get the group across the line. People prefer to work on their own. But I think it might be indicative of the fact that many of these students have had to work in isolation for so long that they were kind of welcoming the idea of working in a group. Smaller tasks, reflection tasks, more assessments split into sections, same again. Quiz during class once a week, which I thought was a lovely idea. Again, this is formative assessment and the students seem to have an appetite for it. Presentations, more group work, continuous assessment, work as groups to split up readings, different ways to present, posters, videos. And I just thought they came up with some really creative and innovative stuff. A group poster, similar, this group was very specific, where on the marks breakdown, and they were happy to look at all ways, like the summative piece, the exam at the end, and a PowerPoint assessment, and choose group work. And I love this, choose your own groups. So they're very specific that they would choose who they worked with. And we know that sometimes it might work better if the groups are allocated. But I think it was just a nice little inclusion there. Attendance could be part of the continuous assessment. Guidance, more guidance in the brief, a video, and submit a journal entry. So really nice, interesting stuff came up there. Again, the quiz came up. I think that would be really of interest to some instructors who haven't used them before. Make a poster. So I think this is really interesting stuff. I'd like to thank you for your time and attention. This presentation has gone on a little bit longer than I expected, but I do hope that you got some nice feedback from it. As I mentioned earlier, the students actually did complete Canberra's questionnaire for reflective thinking, which will form part of a bigger research kind of presentation I'll be doing on this small project in the future. But in the meantime, if you have any questions, any comments, or any feedback, do contact me at the email address below. And just for references and further reading, that's available here on the presentation as well. And thanks for your attention, and hope to see you later at the National Centre for Men's Health presentation from 1:15 p.m.